Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Layak Siddiqui, the father of Holophase. Remember the language we are learning. There is one field, phi, the holophase. One continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, the three dimensions show themselves at once. Time as omega, space as k, and motion as nu, built from both. In earlier parts, we often called this motion dimension v. In this program, we will speak it as nu, the same kinematic dimension, the same meaning, just a clearer audio label. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and a motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, we focus on one essential component of the epistemic firewall: micro-orientation. This part is part 61, Gödel for physics, Operational Incompleteness. Its firewall job is to protect science from the dream of a final theory that never ends, and from the tyranny of a single formalism that claims it can close everything. The core revelation is simple and strict. There exist physical truths that cannot be fully derived, certified, or closed inside any one admissible grammar, not because we are lazy or ignorant, but because of structural limits. The skill you gain is how to stay rigorous without becoming rigid, how to stay humble without surrender, and how to grow science without smuggling in new primitives. Now let's begin with a human problem that hides inside every advanced civilization. When a grammar works beautifully in one domain, we start to treat it like reality itself. We stop saying, "This is a tool," and we start saying, "This is what the world is." We stop seeing the firewall as a licensing system, and we start seeing it as a temple. That is the failure mode this part prevents: idolatry of formalism. Holophase says, the map is not the territory. Even the best map has edges. Even the most disciplined grammar has undecidable zones. And the firewall must be able to label those zones precisely, so that science stays open, revisable, and honest. Concept definition. An admissible grammar, call it G, is a finite set of rules, equations, and transformation laws, written only in terms of phi and its derivatives, and disciplined by the firewall. Admissible means it is internally consistent, and it can actually license some windows of phenomena under falsification. A grammar family, call it F, is a whole class of such grammars that share a common structure. For example, a family might restrict itself to certain kinds of locality assumptions, or certain kinds of coupling assumptions, or certain kinds of allowable terms built from derivatives. To say a grammar is complete for a domain would mean, for every well-formed, testable statement S about phi patterns in that domain, the grammar can decide S. In audio terms, decide means it can do one of two things under license. It can issue predictions that, if confirmed, certify S as true, or it can issue predictions that, if falsified, certify S as false. No endless maybe, no permanent fog. Completeness would mean the grammar can always close the case. Operational incompleteness says, that dream fails, and it fails lawfully. Here is the theorem in simple speech. For any admissible, non-trivial grammar family F that is rich enough to describe its own measurement and certification procedures, meaning it can model sensors, windows, licenses, and the act of inference, there will exist true, measurable constraints on phi that cannot be decided within F. They are real patterns, they can be stable, they can be reproduced. But within that family, no finite grammar can give them a clean license that closes. This is not philosophical speculation. It is a firewall statement about what finite rule systems can do when they try to certify a world that can certify them back. Why this is necessary? Without this theorem, a civilization will keep pushing one grammar family to do everything. When it fails, it will either deny the phenomenon or patch the grammar with endless additions until it becomes unfalsifiable. Both are forms of epistemic tyranny, forcing the world to fit the tool, then calling the tool ultimate. Operational incompleteness breaks that tyranny in advance. It tells us the firewall will never work itself out of a job. There will always be frontiers. Now we translate the theorem into the Holophase lens. Triunity always coupled. We start with the spoken equation, phi of x and t. Phi as a function of position and time. From phi, we read the three shadows together. Omega, written as the Greek letter omega, the rhythm and persistence in time. K, the spatial structure, arrangement, and pattern scale. Nu, written as the Greek letter nu, the kinematic or motion dimension. Propagation, coupling, transformation, what we earlier called V. In a healthy decidable domain, a grammar can close omega, k, and nu together in one coherent account. If it can predict the time rhythm, it can predict the spatial pattern, and it can predict the way the pattern moves and interacts, all in one net. The ledger stabilizes. Incompleteness appears when that joint closure becomes structurally impossible within a family, even though partial closures succeed separately. This is the signature. Persistent failure to jointly close omega, k, and nu inside one grammar, while partial closures in pairs or singles look excellent. Let me make that vivid in plain language. Imagine three witnesses describing the same event: a time witness, a space witness, and a motion witness. In an ordinary case, you can write one consistent report that respects all three. In an incomplete domain, within a certain family, every time you try to write a single consistent report, something breaks. If you fit the time witness perfectly, you must flatten the space witness. If you fit the space witness perfectly, you must freeze the motion witness. If you fit the motion witness perfectly, you must blur either time or space. The family can tell partial truths, but it cannot tell the whole triunity truth at once, under one consistent finite report. That is operational incompleteness. It is not, we haven't tried hard enough. It is, the structure of this family cannot capture the full triunity closure in this regime with a finite, consistent rule set. Now we bring in the demotion rule. Energy is tally only. Energy is not a thing. It is accounting, constrained bookkeeping of how well omega, k, and nu cohere. In complete domains, different admissible representations of the same phenomenon produce energy tallies that converge. The ledger closes. In incomplete domains, within a given family, energy tallies oscillate between admissible forms without convergence. This is not an error to be corrected by force. It is a diagnostic signature. It tells us the accounting standard inside this family is ambiguous here. The phenomenon is real, but the family cannot produce a representation-independent ledger. Here is a short analogy, and then we exit. Imagine two equally valid accounting methods for a company, both allowed by the same accounting standards. In a normal situation, as you refine the books, both methods converge on the same profit number. But imagine a situation where the standards themselves are insufficient for a new kind of transaction. Then two methods give different profits, and no rule inside that standard set tells you which is the real one. The non-convergence is not a moral failure. It is evidence that the standards need expansion. Operational interpretation. How does this show up in practice? It shows up as pattern non-closure. not random noise, but repeatable failure shapes. A family approaches a frontier, and again you see the same kind of divergence, the same kind of trade off, the same kind of paradox. Sometimes this looks like infinities that appear in calculations and cannot be removed within that family. Sometimes it looks like contradictory requirements. To preserve one license condition, you must violate another. Sometimes it looks like uncomputable predictions. The grammar can write a rule but cannot, even in principle, compute its consequences to a decidable output within scope. The firewall does not panic. It does not call this mystery energy. It does not invent new primitives. It labels the regime precisely, an undecidable zone relative to family F. Now, because this is episode 11, we must make the firewall role explicit. Firewall role. Operational incompleteness prevents final theories, absolute laws, and epistemic tyranny. It forces humility into the method. It guarantees openness. It ensures that the best possible outcome of science is not a closed canon, but a growing registry, stable kernels where licenses are strong, and shadow archives where boundaries are documented. This is why I call it Gödel for physics. In Gödel's work, the point is not that mathematics is broken. The point is that any sufficiently rich, consistent system cannot prove all truths expressible within it. Here, the point is not that physics is broken. The point is that any sufficiently rich, admissible grammar family cannot certify all true phi constraints within it. The firewall learns to live with that lawfully. Now we include a spoken form of the structure. We say, let F be a grammar family. Let S be a testable statement about a phi pattern. Operational incompleteness says, there exist statements S that are true in the world, but undecidable in F. Undecidable means no grammar in F can license S as true or false without either contradiction, infinite regress, or loss of admissibility. Notice what the theorem does not say. It does not say anything goes. It does not say truth is relative. It does not say science is weak. It says something more disciplined. Licensing is relative to a grammar family, and some truths require stepping outside the grammar that discovered them. That is the second operational meaning. Some truths require assent. You may need to move to a broader family, call it F prime, to certify what F could not. But F prime will have its own undecidable zone. There is no final ladder rung that ends the journey. Now, let's keep this audio simple with a concrete triunity picture. Suppose a phenomenon has very fine spatial structure. K is large in the sense of tight patterning. And it also evolves very quickly. Omega is high. And it also has strong coupling and propagation effects. Nu is rich. Within a certain family, you can often do two of these well, but not all three together. You can do omega and k, but only by treating nu as simple. You can do k and nu, but only by treating omega as slow or frozen. You can do omega and nu, but only by smoothing out k. The point is not which pair. The point is the recurring trade-off. Joint closure fails in a patterned way. That trade-off is not just inconvenience. It is a structural limit. And the firewall must recognize it, because otherwise a civilization will waste centuries trying to force trial or closure where it cannot exist inside the current toolbox. Now we must state the episode's axioms at least twice, and we will do that now, with deep simplicity. Rules do not become real by elegance, consensus, or tradition. They earn a license only by surviving falsification, variation, independence, and scope discipline. And when a rule fails, we do not believe harder. We tighten, downgrade, or retire its license. Operational incompleteness says, sometimes the failure is not a single rule. It is a whole family reaching a lawful boundary. The correct response is not to demand success. The correct response is to label the boundary and govern the search for a new family. Prediction. Here is the explicit prediction of Part 61, spoken plainly. For certain regimes of phi, every admissible grammar in a given family F will encounter structured, repeatable, non-closure patterns. It will not be random. The failure will have a recognizable shape: persistent trilock breakdown, or pattern divergence, or non-convergent energy tallies across admissible representations. And different researchers, using different pipelines, will find the same failure shape when they push that family into the frontier. That prediction is a firewall prediction. It tells us what mature science should look like. Not a smooth, endless success curve, but regions of strong closure and regions where closure breaks in patterned ways. Falsification and license consequence. Here is the falsification condition. If a supposedly incomplete phenomenon becomes fully closed under a revised admissible grammar, then it was not fundamentally incomplete. The earlier family was insufficient, and the incompleteness was relative to that family. The firewall then takes three actions. It expands the admissible registry to include the new family after standard validation. It reclassifies the phenomenon from the undecidable zone of F to the decidable domain of F prime, and it documents the relativity clearly, so nobody turns a temporary boundary into metaphysics. And if closure never arrives, then the firewall does not despair. It keeps the undecidable zone as a signpost, not a stop sign, guiding research toward new tools, not toward forced patches. Now we answer the three firewall mechanism questions simply, like engineering. What assumption is allowed? It is allowed to say, this is undecidable relative to family F if you provide structured evidence, pattern trilock failures, non-convergent tallies, and proof that the failure is family-wide, not just one model's weakness. What is forbidden? You may not use incompleteness as an excuse for mysticism. You may not claim absolute incompleteness for nature. You must always state relative to family F. You may not insert new primitives to soothe discomfort. And you may not silence anomalies by redefining words until the ledger pretends to close. What happens when the check fires? The firewall marks an undecidable zone in the registry for family F. It strengthens scope discipline. Beyond this boundary, do not issue licenses using only F. It directs work toward finding or constructing a broader admissible family, while preserving the stable kernel of F where it works. It also preserves the shadow archive of failures, because those failures are boundary information for the next generation. Now, I will offer one restrained example and keep it short. In many deep problems at the edges of current modeling, you can close one aspect of the story beautifully, but the full operational story refuses to close without trade-offs. Whether the specific frontier is later conquered or remains a long-term boundary, the incompleteness lens gives a disciplined posture. Do not pretend a partial closure is total closure, and do not turn boundary pain into metaphysical claims. A second restrained example. In many complex systems, you can model average behavior beautifully. But if you insist on simultaneously capturing detailed structure, fast timing, and full coupling, the computation explodes, or the description becomes effectively uncomputable. That is not a moral failure. It is a structural sign that a certain family's closure power is bounded in that regime. Now we come to the human gift of this theorem, the skill you gain as a listener. The skill is recognizing structural limits without mysticism. When faced with a hard problem, you learn to ask four questions. Is this a trilock failure? Can we close omega or k or nu separately but not together? Is the failure patterned? Does it recur the same way across attempts? Is it family-wide? Do all grammars of a certain type hit the same wall? And what would closure even look like? Can a license be issued without contradiction or infinite regress? These questions protect you from two extremes: cynicism and fanaticism. Cynicism says nothing can be known. Fanaticism says one grammar can know everything. Holophase says many things can be known under license, but no grammar family is final, and boundaries are part of the architecture of honest knowledge. Now we reinforce the axioms one final time, because they are the heartbeat of episode 11. Rules do not become real by elegance, consensus, or tradition. They earn a license only by surviving falsification, variation, independence, and scope discipline. When a rule fails, we do not believe harder. We tighten, downgrade, or retire its license. Operational Incompleteness adds, when a family hits a structural limit, we do not demand that it conquer the limit. We mark the boundary, preserve the kernel, and govern the search for a broader family. There is also a practical emotional reason this chapter matters. When researchers hit a wall, they often react in one of two ways. Some become angry and declare the world irrational. Others become loyal to the grammar and declare the anomaly impossible. Both reactions are the same mistake. They treat the firewall as an identity instead of a tool. Operational incompleteness offers a third reaction: disciplined curiosity. It says, record the wall, measure the wall, describe its shape. Do not patch it with fantasies. Do not deny it with pride. Let it teach you what your grammar cannot yet do. Here is a simple audio exercise. Imagine three dials in front of you labeled omega, k, and nu. Turn the omega dial to the value the data demands. Now turn the k dial to the value the data demands. Now ask the grammar to predict the nu dial. If the grammar predicts nu correctly, the triunity locks. If it predicts nu only by changing omega or k, the lock breaks. Now repeat this in many windows and many representations. In a decidable domain, the dials line up more and more as data improves. In an undecidable domain relative to a family, the alignment keeps slipping in the same patterned way. And notice something beautiful. The wall itself becomes information. The very pattern of failure tells you what kind of extension is needed. It tells you whether you need richer coupling, richer topology, richer window licensing, or a new way to bind omega, k, and nu together without contradiction under the same firewall discipline. Before we leave this, I want the idea to feel concrete the way a good court system feels concrete. A court does not claim it can judge every possible truth in the universe. It claims it can judge the cases that fall within its jurisdiction using its rules of evidence and procedure. When a case falls outside jurisdiction, the court does not pretend. It transfers the case, or it declares that its current procedure cannot decide it. That is not weakness. That is how the court stays legitimate. In Holophase, an admissible grammar family is like a jurisdiction. It has a domain where its licenses are strong. Outside that domain, it may still generate stories, but those stories are not certified. Operational incompleteness is the firewall learning how to say, with precision, this is a real case, but not decidable inside this court. Now clarify a phrase that is easy to miss here: stepping outside the grammar that discovered the truth. This does not mean betraying the grammar. It means respecting its limits. The grammar can lead you to a boundary by producing a repeating signature of non-closure. It can show you the shape of the wall. But to certify the phenomenon, you may need a larger family, still written only in phi and its derivatives with new admissible moves. So how do we responsibly declare that a phenomenon is undecidable relative to a family? We use an audit battery. I will describe it as 4 gates. Gate 1, the stability gate. If the phenomenon is real, it must survive variation. Change the instrument, change the laboratory, change the pipeline, change the window segmentation. If the core pattern survives, the case is real. If it collapses, it was a measurement artifact, not an incompleteness frontier. Gate 2. The closure attempt gate. You must show that competent attempts at closure were made. Multiple grammars within the family, multiple parameterizations, and multiple admissible representations. If one grammar closes the triunity cleanly, the phenomenon is decidable in that family, and the case is closed. Gate 3. The non-closure signature gate. If closure fails, it must fail in a structured, repeating way, describable in triunity terms. For example, anytime we enforce omega coherence above this threshold, K becomes non-identifiable. Or, anytime we keep K boundary conditions faithful, new coupling becomes underdetermined. These are failure signatures, not complaints. Gate 4. The family-wide gate. You must show the wall is not one grammar's incompetence, but a boundary that appears across the family. That is why we say incompleteness is relative to a family, not to one model. Now listen to the energy tally oscillation signature in a way an audio listener can feel. Imagine you compute an energy-like ledger from one admissible representation. It balances. Then you compute it from a different admissible representation, equally lawful inside the family. It also balances, but to a different number. You refine the data. The first number does not move toward the second. Instead, as you change legitimate window choices, it jumps between them, or slides without convergence. That non-convergence is a message. It says, within this family, energy is not a single representation-independent tally here. The ledger cannot choose one stable account. So we do not force a choice by ideology. We record the oscillation as boundary information, we narrow the scope of licenses, and we open the search for a broader family where the ledger can stabilize. And we must guard against misuse. Incompleteness is not a universal excuse that makes all beliefs equal. It is not blanket fog. It is a structured boundary. The existence of boundaries does not erase stable kernels. Honest boundary labels actually make the kernels stronger because they prevent scope laundering. So a mature science should have two visible layers. A stable kernel where omega, k, and nu close together and the ledger converges, and a shadow archive of documented frontiers where closure attempts hit walls with repeatable signatures. That archive is not shame. It is the map that guides the next ascent. Finally, remember the deep but simple reason incompleteness exists. Reality can be rich, and usable grammars must be finite. A grammar is a disciplined compression of a world. Compression can be faithful, but it cannot be infinitely faithful everywhere at once without becoming the world itself. If you try to compress everything into one final grammar, you either miss truths or you expand until falsification dies. So part 61 is not pessimism. It is protection. It keeps science open, revisable, and resistant to ideology. It teaches the listener to respect the boundary between what is licensed and what is not yet licensable, without mysticism and without despair. And now we are ready for what comes next, the implications. If incompleteness is real, what does it change, and what does it protect? We will carry forward the triunity signature, the tally demotion, and the discipline of licensing, and we will show how incompleteness becomes the deepest layer of the firewall, the layer that stops any civilization from declaring itself finished. If you want to see the full mathematical derivations and exact equations behind this idea, you can search for Holophase on Zenodo. There, you will find the scientific papers that this audio journey is built on. Salam, and peace be upon you.